Hey guys, this is James with thegraymattersblog.com coming to you on another one of my walks through the beautiful South Texas woods. As I'm always trying to find a new, cool, interesting place to shoot some video for you guys, today I am literally in a tree. So I hope you guys like it. I thought this was kind of a cool place. You can kind of through the, it's a really gnarled oak tree. You can kind of see the river through it. So I thought this would be pretty neat. Today I'm going to be reading one of my poems for you called The Crimson Lord. I really like this one. This was one of the poems where I really started learning a lot about meter and rhythm and that kind of thing, and I'll talk a little bit about that after I read it. My lord was decked out all in green, your lord was dressed in red. Two shining hosts were gathered close to hear what would be said. My lord was far too sharp of tongue and hotly cursed your lord. Your lord's steel was sharper still, he struck with flashing sword. His blood flew high, lit by the sun, and before it hit the ground, in burning wrath the armored mass was embattled all around. I drew my great two-handed sword as heavy as the tomb. The honor guard their banner charred, all fell before its doom. Your lord rushed to meet my wrath, a stunning figure made, but the crimson lord's fine red steel sword was shattered by my blade. As I went for the killing blow, his hilt fell from his hand. The hero red of battle's dread spun like the wind and ran. As he ran, he passed a horse whose rider had been felled. He turned its head and on it fled like they were chased by hell. Even though I bent my breast and ran with all my might, my heavy feet were far from fleet, my armor far from light. I roared out my bleeding hate and flung my great sword round. End over end the blade did spin and struck him to the ground. I drew forth my bloody blade that struck him to the core. He drew a breath as cold as death, and then he drew no more. The battle raged, we fought for days, the pillage fires glowed, until your men, these crimson kin, across the river flowed. Now my host is shattered, and I stand the field alone. 1,000 swords that loved your lord surround like standing stones. I've lost my shield, I've lost my sword, my arrows, and my bow. But any knave that thinks him brave, I'll slay with just one blow. I should not live if my lord dies, and so I take this stand. Come and seek your vengeance bleak, and kill me if you can. So guys, that was Crimson Lord. It's kind of got a little Game of Thrones vibe to it, a little Arthurian legend vibe to it, you know, your kind of classic sword and sorcery kind of setting. This was one of the ones, like I said, where I really started playing with rhyme scheme, really started playing with rhythm. One of the things is that it actually has a little more complicated rhyme scheme, as you've noticed. You know, it rhymes 3 times in one line and 2 in another. And that's a little more complicated to do. You have to think of a lot more rhymes, but it also gives it a lot more dynamic sound, and I think makes it a lot more entertaining to listen to. Another thing is, this is where I really started playing with rhythm, and it's really funny how rhythm and meter work, because anything that shares a rhythm and a meter is going to like sound like each other, even like subconsciously. One of the things everyone loves to point out is that Emily Dickinson poems all have about the same meter, and as a result, any Emily Dickinson poem you can sing to the tune of the Yellow Rose of Texas. And usually once someone knows that, they can never stop doing it. So, you know, next time you're reading I Could Not Stop for Death, you know, you'll be singing in your head, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. His carriage held but he and I and all eternity. Yeah, you'll sing every Emily Dickinson poem to the tune of the Yellow Rose of Texas for the rest of your life. And as I was reading this one, and I started reading it back to myself and, you know, playing around with it, I realized that it shares a meter with 2 different songs. One is Iko Iko, which is that famous kind of kid song, kind of New Orleans-y kind of thing. You know, my flag boy and your flag boy were sitting by the fire. My flag boy said to your flag boy, I'm gonna set your flag on fire. You know, it's the sort of gibberishy chorus that's Giacomo Fino anane, Giacomo Fino ne. You know, it's called Iko Iko. And another one is actually an old English folk song called Matty Groves. I'm going to link both of those in our comments here so that you guys can listen to them and see. But it shares a meter with both of those, so you could almost sing this to either one of those. And I thought that was pretty cool. And one of the things I want to take a minute to talk about here is something that's been coming up in a lot of the writing groups, especially kind of poetry groups, is about kind of the nature of poetry, and all writers, poets included. It's something me and Sharon have talked about recently. As you start becoming a writer, you grow what we call your writer teeth. Your writer teeth start coming in, and what we mean by that is you get this just absolute like fighting mad response to any time anyone tells you there's such a thing as a rule, which is natural. You should have that. When you're starting out, it takes a certain amount of arrogance to be a writer and even more arrogance to be a poet. So you need that where you're like, to heck with what you say. I can write anything I want, and then go out and do it, because you have to write some really bad stuff to begin with because you don't know the difference yet. And so you need that kind of arrogance. You need those writer teeth where it says, you really should, bother to learn what show versus tell is, and you snap at them and go, the heck I do, and just write it anyway. And that's fine for a beginner. But eventually you need to progress to the part where you do start learning what some of that means so that you can get better. And it's kind of that way with poetry, learning what rhyme schemes are and the fact that there are different ones, learning what meters are and the fact that there are different ones, and that you can really start doing some cool stuff with it. It's fine to start just being instinctive. If all your stuff sounds like the music you listen to, that's fine. That just means you're instinctively going with meter. But eventually you need to start learning what this stuff is. And a lot of poets, especially that I've been talking to anyway, they just really get bristly, and they, point to the fact that free verse exists, and free verse does exist, and that just means a poem is free verse if it doesn't have any specific rhyme or any specific meter. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have any rhyme, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have meter. It just means it may have kind of your own custom blend, while it doesn't technically have to. If you are using no rhyme scheme whatever, and you are using no meter whatsoever, it has no flow, no rhythm to it whatsoever, you're not using any alliteration, you're not using any kind of poetic device, then what you've written is really not poetry. It's prose. I know that's blasphemy. You can't say something's not poetry. But the difference between prose and poetry, prose is just regular written words, a novel is prose, an essay is prose. And if you're going to write something that you don't care how it sounds, you're just focusing on the words, then that's prose. Even if it's emotional, that's what a lot of people say is, well, if it's emotional, it's poetry, which is bull, because prose can be highly emotional. And, so if you're going to write prose, then call it prose. If you're writing poetry, you need to be thinking about how it sounds in addition to what the words say, because that's part of what makes it poetry. Poetry is that kind of middle ground between prose and music, which is why a lot of poetry lyrics sound like song lyrics. And you'll often see that when people are talking about poetry, they'll bring up songs that it reminds them of, or bring up songs that it sounds like. And a lot of poems get set to music eventually. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up, and how when you look into poems like this and you start thinking about how it sounds and thinking about meter and thinking about rhyme, how it starts really kind of opening this other stuff up, and you start to be able to do cool stuff with the sound of your poems that you couldn't do when you were just relying on instinct. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed my little rant on poetry, and I will see you guys on my next walk.